to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating episode.
We are diving deep today, deep into the return of Daredevil, one of our favorite gritty superheroes.
Yeah!
We're breaking down the first 2 episodes of Daredevil, board again on Disney+, and I gotta say right off the bat, this is not just like a rehashing of the Netflix show.
Right.
Like there's some real twists and turns, some shocking stuff, and some really cool connections to the larger MCU. So let's unpack it all.
Yeah, it's striking how Born Again just drops us right back into Matt Murdock's world, but the tone is so much darker this time around. You know, we see Matt, he seems like he's finally found some peace, but then bam, tragedy hits.
Oh, absolutely. And that opening fight scene, oh my gosh. Daredevil and Bullseye going at it in this brutal bar brawl that spills out into the streets, and the whole thing is shot in one take.
It's incredible.
Knives flying, billiard balls are suddenly weapons. Like,
Yeah.
It really sets the stage for a much more intense, a much more mature Daredevil that we're dealing with here.
Oh yeah, and then, as if things couldn't get any worse, Bullseye kills Foggy Nelson.
I know.
It's a huge turning point in the show, and it sends Matt into this downward spiral. He's forced to confront this line he's always sworn he would never cross, that vow against killing.
Right, you've got Matt reeling from this devastating loss. And then on top of it, Wilson Fisk is back. But he's not just the kingpin of crime anymore.
Yeah.
He's the newly elected mayor of New York City.
Mayor Fisk.
I mean, it's a bold move by the writers to put him in a position of like legitimate power. What do you make of that choice?
Well, you know, I think it's really fascinating because it taps into this very real kind of anxiety that we have about powerful figures. Even ones, you know, with a known criminal past, how they can manipulate systems and rise to these positions of authority. I mean, it makes you wonder about the limits of law and order. Like when someone like Fisk can become mayor, you know, what does that even mean?
And the show doesn't shy away from reminding us that Fisk is a convicted felon, like they say it outright.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how easily people with money and power can kind of rewrite history, manipulate public perception, and essentially erase those past transgressions.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it seems like the show is kind of asking us, like, what happens when the very systems that are supposed to uphold justice are corrupted from the inside?
Right.
And what does that mean for someone like Daredevil, who operates, you know, outside those systems?
Yeah, he's already kind of walking this fine line.
Yeah.
Now let's talk MCU connections, because I gotta admit, I geeked out when Daredevil popped up in Spider-Man No Way Home, and then again in She-Hulk, and then we saw him in Echo.
Yeah.
But now in Born Again, we have Fisk actually mentioning Spider-Man by name.
It's so cool.
Like they're weaving this really intricate web connecting all these different corners of the MCU.
I know, and it's not just these little subtle nods either. Born Again also addresses like the repeal of the Sokovia Accords, those, you know, controversial international regulations for superheroes.
Oh yeah, from Civil War.
Exactly, which were overturned, you know, eventually in She-Hulk. So, I mean, it really shows how committed they are to this continuity, to creating a universe that feels cohesive, you know, across all these different properties.
It's really cool to see how they're bringing all these threads together. But, you know, some critics have pointed out that Born Again feels like it's revisiting that familiar theme. Like Matt struggling with his role as Daredevil.
Right.
We saw that a lot in the Netflix series.
Yeah.
Do you think it feels repetitive, like we're going over the same ground?
You know, it's a valid point. I mean, the show does seem to retread some of that familiar territory, at least in these first 2 episodes. But I think the context is totally different now.
Right.
Having Fisk as the mayor, I mean, it raises the stakes so much higher than before. And Matt's struggle isn't just about these personal demons anymore, you know? He's confronting a system that's corrupt, like at its very core.
That's a good point. It's not just a personal battle for Matt, it's a systemic one. But let's talk about some of the new characters who are adding to this really complex mix. I'm intrigued by Heather Glenn, Matt's love interest, who also happens to be Fisk's marriage therapist.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about complicated relationships.
It's just like a recipe for disaster right there.
It is.
But her position also creates this really fascinating, like, moral dilemma, you know? Is she using her access to Fisk for good, you know, trying to manipulate him from the inside? Or is he playing her? I mean, it just adds so much intrigue to the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have this young, ambitious video journalist, Bibi Urich, and she's interviewing Fisk, but she has no idea he's the one who killed her uncle.
Right.
It feels like a classic Daredevil storyline pulled straight from the comics. I'm so curious to see how that plays out.
Me too.
It has the potential to get really intense. especially as BB gets closer and closer to the truth about Fisk and his empire.
Yeah, I mean, it could really explore like the dangers of investigative journalism, the personal costs of truth-seeking and justice.
Absolutely. It seems like everyone in Matt Murdock's world is somehow entangled with Fisk. And then on top of everything else, we have this new vigilante who shows up, White Tiger. And she comes onto the scene right when Daredevil is supposedly retired.
Oh, yeah.
Which is really interesting because, Matt himself struggles so much with the morality of vigilantism. So what do we know about White Tiger so far?
Well, it seems like they're pulling from White Tiger's comic book origins.
Okay.
Which involve like this really tragic backstory. She was wrongfully imprisoned.
Oh, wow.
And it sets up this really interesting conflict, right? Because like, will Matt condemn White Tiger for taking the law into her own hands when he's grappling with those same questions?
Absolutely. And it's like a mirror, right?
Yes.
It's like his internal conflict is playing out on a larger scale.
Exactly.
With this new vigilante coming in.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like they're showing us what Matt's going through, but with this whole other character coming into the mix. But speaking of Matt's struggles, there's this really intense scene where these corrupt cops, they try to execute him.
Oh my God.
And Charlie Cox's performance is phenomenal. Like, you see Matt's vulnerability. You feel that inner turmoil he's going through.
Oh, that scene is brutal. It just highlights how even with all of his abilities, Matt's still so vulnerable. And it's not just like a physical beating either. It's emotional. Like, they really force him to confront his own mortality and what could happen if he keeps going down this path as Daredevil.
Totally. And did you catch the detail about the cops? They're wearing Punisher skulls as tattoos.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, come on, that has to be foreshadowing, right?
Oh.
We know John Bernthal is coming back as the Punisher later this season.
For sure, for sure. I mean, it's such a deliberate choice by the writers, and it's so smart because the Punisher symbol has become, really complex, especially how it's been used by certain groups in real life. So it really raises questions about the meaning of symbols and how they can be twisted and used to justify violence.
Right.
I think the show is setting us up for this really interesting exploration of those themes when Punisher comes back.
Oh, I can't wait to see how that dynamic plays out between them. It's going to be explosive.
But it's not all doom and gloom in Born to Run. Again, they do give his moments of humor sprinkled throughout the episodes, like Matt's awkward attempts at flirting,
Yeah.
Or even just like his witty banter with Foggy before,
Right. And those lighter moments are so important. They give you a little break from all the drama.
Yeah.
And they remind you that even amidst all this darkness and intensity, there's still room for, humanity and connection.
Exactly. It makes the characters feel so much more real, so much more relatable. And speaking of real, I mean, it's hard not to see the parallels between Fisk's rise to power and like what we're seeing in the current political climate. It feels very much like it's reflecting, the times we're living in, where money and influence can often overshadow truth and justice. Absolutely. I think the show really taps into this fear, that we have about how easily systems designed to protect us can actually be manipulated by those in power. And I think it also asks us, like, what's our role as individuals in fighting back against that?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if Daredevil's approach to justice, his whole vigilante thing, if that even works in a world where it seems like the very foundation of law and order is crumbling. I mean, if someone like Fisk can become mayor, what hope is there for achieving real justice through the traditional means?
Yeah, and that seems to be like the central question at the heart of Born Again, Is Daredevil's approach, is it outdated in a world where the lines between good and evil are so blurry? Or does it make his role even more important? I think it's a dilemma that's going to continue to unfold throughout the season.
Yeah, for sure. And as we see Matt grappling with that dilemma, we really see the toll it's taking on him. He's wrestling with his faith, he's battling his inner demons. It's a side of Daredevil that we don't often get to see in other superhero stories.
Right, and I think that's what makes Born Again so compelling. It's not afraid to show us the human cost of being a hero. Matt's flawed, he's vulnerable, and he's really struggling to reconcile his actions with his beliefs. And I think it just makes him a much more relatable and ultimately a more human character.
Exactly. It reminds us that even heroes have doubts, they make mistakes, and they have to deal with the consequences of their choices. And it's refreshing to see that, it's so different from those traditional, almost idealized portrayals of superheroes that we often get.
Right. I think Born Again is more interested in those gray areas of morality, the complexities of what it means to be human. Even Fisk, As ruthless and calculating as he is, you see those little glimpses of vulnerability, the pain that drives him.
Oh, absolutely. And it's those glimpses of humanity that make the characters all the more fascinating. It's not just this black and white good versus evil story. It's this nuanced look at like their motivations and their struggles and the choices that have made them who they are.
It's what sets the show apart from other superhero shows. You know, it goes deeper, it asks those tough questions about justice and power and what it really means to be a hero. And it does it all with these incredible performances and amazing action sequences and just this emotional depth that draws you in.
And even though the show definitely has those dark moments, there are these moments of levity and human connection.
Yeah.
You know, we see the bond between Matt and Foggy, even in the face of tragedy. We see the potential for new relationships like his connection with Heather Glenn. And ultimately, we see the resilience of the human spirit, that belief that even in the darkest time, there's always something worth fighting for.
And it's those connections, you know, those moments where they reach out, those glimmers of hope that give you the strength to keep going, even when it feels like the world's trying to drag you down. I think Daredevil, Born Again, doesn't shy away from those dark realities, but it also reminds us that there's beauty and strength even in the most unexpected places.
It's that mix of darkness and hope, you know? That's what makes this show so powerful, so relevant to like what we're all going through. But let's talk about that final scene in episode 2, where those corrupt cops corner Matt. I mean, they're literally trying to execute him. It's brutal to watch him get beaten down like that.
Yeah, that scene is just masterfully directed. The slow, methodical brutality, the way they filmed it, it's almost like you're watching through a peephole, like you're right there with Matt feeling every punch, every kick. It's a testament to Charlie Cox, you know? He does so much with his physicality, you can see the pain in his face.
Oh, yeah. And then when he finally snaps, you hear this primal scream as he just unleashes his rage. It's terrifying, but it's also kind of cathartic at the same time. You can feel all those years of pent-up frustration, the weight of his moral code, the burden of carrying that darkness inside him.
Totally. And it's a good reminder that even with all his abilities, Matt's still human, you know?
Yeah.
He has limits, and those limits are constantly being pushed. It's like a breaking point for him, where he has to confront the worst parts of himself just to survive.
And the way those cops taunt him, with their Punisher skull tattoos, it's like they're trying to push him over the edge.
Right.
Like they're using this symbol of brutal justice to justify their actions. And it makes you think about the consequences of vigilantism, how it can inspire others to take the law into their own hands, you know, and it doesn't always end well.
It's brilliant, though, because it sets up that inevitable showdown between Daredevil and the Punisher later in the season. I mean, you have these two sides of the same coin, both driven by this thirst for justice, but with such different approaches.
It'd be so good to see them go head to head.
Oh, for sure.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Daredevil, Born Again, what are your final thoughts?
Well, this show is just a masterclass in superhero storytelling. It's dark, it's gritty, and it doesn't pull any punches when it comes to showing violence and corruption. But ultimately, it's a story about hope and resilience, about that part of us that keeps fighting for what's right, even when it feels like we're surrounded by darkness.
It's a show that makes us look at ourselves, you know, confront our own beliefs about justice, about morality, and the choices we make in a world that can feel so broken sometimes. And even though there aren't any easy answers, I think Daredevil, Born Again, reminds us that the journey itself is what matters, and that fighting for a better world is a fight that we can't give up on.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. If someone like Wilson Fisk, with all his money and power, can climb to the top of the system, what does that say about the systems we rely on for justice? And where does that leave someone like Daredevil, who operates outside those systems, forced to make impossible choices in a world where right and wrong aren't always so clear?
It's a question that really stays with you, even after the credits roll. It makes you think about your own role in the fight for a more just world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another exploration of the stories that matter.